All right, there we go. As an introduction, we'd like to acknowledge that our mission at Vose Library is to advance learning, inspire curiosity, enrich lives, and promote community. And with that in mind, let me introduce our guest. B.J. Jameson is the genealogy reference specialist at the Maine State Library, which lets her indulge her love of books and genealogy to an extent that she didn't think was possible before she accepted the position. She has a postgraduate certificate in genealogy from the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, Scotland. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. She'll help me with that if I didn't.
Close enough.
Okay. As well as a master's degree in library science. And without further ado, please help me welcome BJ. So welcome, BJ. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Glad to be here. I always, anytime I can get an audience that's not my cats, I'm happy.
Well, here we are.
So let me share my screen. Let's see, which one is it here? I think it's this one. And you should be seeing my PowerPoint at this point.
Yes, we do.
Okay, wonderful. Speaking of cats, so I am going to stop my camera so that you are not distracted by me or my cats. All right, so what I'm going to talk tonight about is how to use Ancestry. But one of the things I want you to understand is that when I say Ancestry, you should hear Ancestry, Family Search, MyHeritage, Find My Past, which are the 4 big genealogy websites. 3 of them are commercial. Ancestry, you can access it, the library version at most libraries in the state of Maine. MyHeritage, you can access at home through the portal at the state library, which is library.digitalmaine.org. Find My Past, we don't currently have the library version of. It's mostly aimed at British and Irish sources at the moment. But if you're like me and have Scottish-born grandparents with Irish-born great-great-grandparents, it's very helpful. And Family Search is free, but you need to register for an account. Most of what I'm going to talk about tonight and next week will actually be very similar at each site, although each has its own little quirks. But I just wanted you to understand that I say this is Ancestry, but it's really how to use the big genealogy websites. And the things that people who are starting out stumble over with the actual websites. So let's take a look. And I will say, first of all, that if this is your ancestor, I cannot help you. I can always tell as soon as somebody has read what the arrow is pointing at. The facial expressions give it away. So, sometimes the problems aren't the user. Sometimes the problems are the record says something like a man with a big nose instead of somebody's name in a census return. So, there are things that you just can't work your way around. But a lot of other things, being flexible and tinkering around the edges of how you're searching and so on, will let you find things that don't come up when you first put names in the little boxes. So the big thing to remember is both that Ancestry is an amazingly wonderful resource that 20 years ago, none of us could have imagined. It's also a huge sprawling mess. And that's sort of the nature of the beast, because we've gotten used to databases. If you put in, if you go into the local auto parts store and you ask for a part, it's got a part number, one thing pops up. The entire database is formatted the same way. At the big genealogy websites, you have different databases with different information within the whole thing. So you have census returns, you have birth records, you have court records, you have apprenticeship records. The index cards for membership in the Massachusetts Masons pre-World War II are at Ancestry. And they're a very different set of data than the 1851 English census. And so part of the fact that it's a sprawling mess is that you have so many different types of data. And it's hard to sometimes go from one database to another. It's really, Ancestry is really just a collection of databases that you can search all at once, or you can search individually. And there are times that searching individually is going to be a better way to go about things. So those of you who, like me, took Latin in high school will recognize the idea that, like Gaul, Ancestry is divided into three parts. The first one is if you've had your DNA tested, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight. The second part is the family trees that people like you and me submit. I'll touch on that, but I'm not going to go into great detail on it. And they can be helpful, but they're not what you want to focus on, especially early in your research. The third part, and where we're going to spend our time tonight, is talking about the digitized records they have. And these are records that are essentially, with a few exceptions, what you would see if you went to an archive or a library. So when we look at the Irish census records, or say the English census records, we're seeing the exact same thing we'd see if we went to the National Archives in London. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's what we're going to be focused on tonight, because that's really where you want to do your research. Ancestry makes it easy to look at the family tree and hit, add this person to my tree. Don't do that. You'll drive yourself nuts. So one of the first things you want to do is actually read the directions. Ancestry does what's called fielded searches, where when you put a name in the last name box on the search page, it's only looking for that last name in the last name boxes. How is this helpful? Well, my grandmother's maiden name was Arthur. So if I put Arthur in a website, like many newspaper database websites are full text search, I put Edward Arthur, her father's name, in a full text search, and I get every single Edward Arthur Roberts, Edward Arthur Johnson, Edward Arthur McMichael, Edward Arthur whatever. Whereas at Ancestry, it's only looking for Arthurs in the field tagged last name or surname. So can you see how that's helpful compared to a full text search? But it also means if you're not sure of something, was this a hyphenated name or was it a middle name? Hyphenated last name versus middle name, you may want to put both in. One of the other things I found recently is that for some records, whoever did the transcribing or the indexing wasn't paying attention and didn't know how things were done in that time and place. So there's a whole bunch of entries where you get men who were listed in a baptismal or marriage record as John Robinson Farmer, John Robinson Taylor, where Taylor and Farmer were their occupation, not their last name, have gotten listed by that as their last name. And so one of the things you'll want to do when, for example, when you have a married couple or you're looking for a marriage, you want to look for both names in succession, because if one name got messed up, you may find something where if it says John Robinson Farmer, you'll recognize that that is Sarah Smith's husband, because you know her kids were named Robinson, even though Farmer got put in the fielded search as the surname. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. One of the other things that can be tricky is knowing which records are covered. And this is one reason will, as we go on, I'll talk about why it's best to drill down and look at a specific database within the website rather than just doing the search the whole website. Because, for example, there are times that it will say these records cover, 1880 to 1920, and it turns out it'll say in the blurb at the bottom, there are scattered records from the 1880s, and you really only get good coverage starting in 1891, which means that if you're looking for somebody where something happened in the 1880s, it may mean that there's a record somewhere, it just didn't get put in this database. I've also seen this happen geographically, where it will say Ohio county marriages, Ohio, marriages registered in Ohio by county, and, or select counties. But they'll say Ohio county marriages, and it sounds like they've got the whole state, but they'll have 17 counties out of 80 some for the state in the database. And so if you're looking for a Cleveland marriage and it only has the counties around Cincinnati and Columbus, you're not going to find your Cleveland area marriage. So you want to make sure which records are covered, because the websites, Ancestry and so on, want to make it look like they've got as many records as they can. And so they don't necessarily lie about what they have, but they may exaggerate, or they may have a title that sort of obscures what they've got. And then I'm going to come back to the idea of indexes versus extracted and so on. You definitely want to be flexible. I can tell you that you want to poke around with different sets of information you put in as you're searching, because you'll want to give yourself as many possibilities of finding something. So one of the things that people sometimes struggle with is that the more you put into the boxes on the search screen, the fewer results you'll get, because they're really looking to answer, if you've put in 10 parameters for your search, it's going to try to match all 10. If you've put in 4, it's only going to try to match the 4. Now, if you've got somebody like me in Scotland, my great-great-grandfather was named William Patterson. And the problem isn't that I find a William Patterson, it's that I find 157 of them. And so, yes, I'm going to want to do some narrowing down. But at the same time, you need to balance getting lots of results versus getting none, or eliminating a record because it's not got the information that you thought it should have, where it says somebody was born in the wrong, I have cases where I had one couple great grandfather, I kept looking for his birth in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and it was only finally one stray record that said Pennsylvania. And then when I went and looked, there he was in Pennsylvania. So by saying he was born in Massachusetts or New Hampshire, I was ruling out records that actually were relevant. So the types of records you'll find, as I said, you'll get submitted trees, you'll get indexed records. This is basically, for index records, you get a name and a reference, name and page number, name, father's name, baptismal date. Extracted records have a bit more. You know, if the father's occupation is there, you might get that. If the farm they lived on is there, you might get that. Transcribed records are word for word, essentially, of what was there, but typed out. And then digitized are what you find in many cases at Ancestry. So, you know, and so we're not going to talk much today about submitted or original, because, you know, the originals are hard copies that you have to go travel. And, you know, I'm always great with an excuse for going to Scotland and Ireland, but, you know, my librarian salary doesn't always cover, you know, going over there for a quick trip. So let's take a look at why you want to dig down and find original records if you can. So here are some submitted trees at Ancestry, and this is an ancestor of mine, Ithamar Wilkins, and he's found in 337 trees as Ithamar T. Wilkins, born in 1711 in Middleton, Massachusetts. They give, you know, parents and wife. The T comes in, even though this is a time when almost nobody in New England had a middle name. There's a later transcription of this that has him as Thomas instead of Ithamar. And so people try to squeeze both of those in here by calling him Ithamar T. Wilkins. He's also interesting because when he gets married, the original record does not have his wife's maiden name on the marriage record. And then he's in another 29 trees, just as Ithamar Wilkins, same parents, same birth date, and no wife, but the same parents. And then he's in one lonely tree, born in 1712, with the same parents, but this 1712 instead of 1711. So, you know, here you have this one tree that has no records and no sources versus these 366 trees that have him born in 1711. So next we find an indexed record. This one's at Family Search. And as you can see, it gives the 1711 birth date. And it says this is from the Massachusetts Town Clerk Vital and Town Records. That sounds pretty official, doesn't it? That you're getting an official record here. Okay, let's take another step back. Here's an extracted record. In the early 1900s, a whole bunch of towns in Massachusetts had their vital records transcribed and printed. They were published with this sort of beigeish, light brown cover. So they're called the tan books. And so here we have Ithamar, son of Bray and Rebecca, born September 15th, 1712. And then in the brackets in these books mean there's alternate information available. Now, it would be easy to assume that this meant death certificate. And I'm guessing at least a couple of you read ahead on this one and figured that this said his death certificate, right? Did anybody do that? Well, if I went, because, you know, I've made too many mistakes in my genealogical career, I went to the beginning of the book, and DC in this context actually means Dorman copy. And what happened was in the 1840s, when Massachusetts started requiring registration of births, marriages, and deaths, a nice 50 years before Maine did. In other words, keep track of siblings who might have gone to Massachusetts, because there's 50 more years of vital records in Massachusetts than in Maine. The town clerk for Middleton was a man named Moses Dorman, and he copied all of the records and sent them to Boston. So this is nice 19th century handwriting. And you can see here we have Ithamar Wilkins, born September 15th, 1711. And then his sister Mehitabel Wilkins, born September 6th, 1712. So this is where most people give up. They figure, you know, we've got a handwritten record. This is as good as it's going to get. Well, I knew Middleton had original records online. So I kept digging. And here we have something that is much older handwriting. I expect even those of you who haven't studied the history of handwriting can tell that that is newer than that, right? And here we have Ithamar, Mehetabel born in 1711 and Ithamar in 1712. So what pretty clearly happened, and I can tell you from looking at the originals and the digitized originals, that this was actually written sometime in the early 1730s, looking at the handwriting and where the entries for other families stopped with this handwriting. And so it's pretty clear that Moses Dorman, 130 some years later, when he went to copy this, mixed this up. And this happens. I mean, if you think about typos, you know, if you were copying an entire record book by hand, you could easily miss something. I have another case. I keep meaning to go back and find the records because it's a great one, where I was looking high and low for a woman that the minister in a marriage record wrote that her maiden name was Small. I kept looking for her, couldn't find her. Finally put it aside and said, okay, this is just, you know, there were several small families in that town. They were big in the town. I was like, you know, there's just somehow she didn't get recorded, or she's from somewhere else, whatever. Couple years later, I was looking at a probate record for somebody else and found her by her married name and looked at her father's name, which was Little. And obviously, absent-minded minister, maybe he'd celebrated the wedding a little too much. Or it was, you know, he'd done the wedding on Sunday and Thursday. He was writing down who he'd married, and there were no families named Little in the town, but there were a bunch named Small. So, you know, even in handwritten stuff, you get mistakes. So why do people tend to have trouble at Ancestry? So some of it's name variations, some of it's issues with indexing, like that example I told you where they put farmer in the surname field instead of the occupation field. Search strategies like being too rigid. Sometimes what you know is wrong. And sometimes, as we just saw, the record is wrong. And so a lot of what you need to do when you're dealing with a site like Ancestry is figure out which of these is the wrong, which of these is what's your stumbling block on this particular search. And how do you get around it? Now, one of the biggest things to remember, spelling does not count. Spelling does not count. Let me say that again. Spelling does not count. When I first started in genealogy, I was living in Ohio, and even though I'm not LDS, I had volunteered at a family history center. And the first time I was doing it by myself, this woman comes in and she insisted that her family had always spelled their last name R-E-E-D for Reed. And she would not look at any R-I-E-Ds, any R-E-I-Ds, any R-E-A-D-Es. She insisted it had to be R-E-E-D. That was approximately 23 years ago. If she has not bent on that, she is still looking for the person that I was trying to help her with, because spelling doesn't count. And it's really not, and this is the thing to remember, is the idea that a person has one official, never changing name, except maybe women when they get married, is very much a 20th century invention. coming out of Social Security and keeping track of the veterans from 2 world wars to a great extent. I mean, think about it. You get somebody who's living in Waldo County in 1880, okay? He doesn't have a driver's license because he doesn't have a car. He doesn't have a health insurance card because there's no health insurance. Social Security hasn't been invented. He doesn't have a credit card because plastic hasn't been invented. You know, people living before World War I to a great extent had a very different relationship, both with their name as an idea and their name as an identifier than we do, because they're not always asked. You know, I call my doctor's office and I say, I'm BJ Jameson, Jameson, without them asking me, because I know they're going to goof it up. The only place it doesn't get goofed up is when I travel in Shetland in the very far north of Scotland. There, people know how to spell it. And I joke about the whiskey, you know, why should I trust a whiskey that doesn't know how to spell its own name? But this is something to remember, that, you know, I have found records for my ancestors that have one I or one E and not the other letter. And it's not that it's not them, it's just that that was not a thing. The other thing to remember is, did the clerk in the office, the minister, the census enumerator, ask to confirm the information with another piece of paper? No. They just wrote down what they were told by the informant, which, you know, usually was a member of the household, but especially in the 19th century on the census, it could be a neighbor. And, you know, is the neighbor going to be really sure, you know, this guy, they came from New York, but were they born in New York, or were they born in Massachusetts before they moved to New York and then to Ohio? The other scenario, think about it, is, you know, you've got a woman whose husband is working in the mill or on the farm or in the mine. She's been doing piecework at home all day. She's got 4 kids that need to be fed. She doesn't know whether he's going to be off drinking his salary. Census taker comes around, says, you know, how old are your kids? She may or may not remember that one of them just turned 5, and she'll say 4. So, you know, that's, and the other thing to remember is the enumerator or whoever wrote what they thought they heard the informant say, then in many cases copied it at least once. Can you see every point here where there could be a misunderstanding? Picture Boston 1890 census, which we no longer have, but picture good Irish American census taker in the north end of Boston with a whole bunch of Italian immigrants who may or may not speak that much English. How's that sound like it's going to come out to have the names perfect? Anyone skeptical it's going to work? I certainly am. So let me show you a couple things, because this is, if you get one thing out of this, this is a good thing to get. There's a couple other things where I'll say if you get one thing, it's a good thing, but this is, in many ways, if you get this, that, you know, it's not that they spelled the name wrong, it's that it was a different culture. It was a different relationship with their name and with information. It will help you more than almost anything else. So you get spelling variations. You get abbreviations. So you'll get WM for William, GEO for George, THOS for Thomas. I've seen all sorts of other of these, you know, ABR with a superscript M for Abraham. Ancestry and these others do a pretty good job, but they often put those at the end. So if you're looking for someone with a fairly common last name named William, you'll want to look for William spelled out WM will, WILM, and so on. Sometimes you'll get filler or the field is left blank on a form. Don't know, unknown. That's often, those are not at all unusual. If someone's filling out a death certificate for somebody, you get, say, a grandchild filling out grandma's death certificate, and grandchild is, numb from grief and may not have known grandma's mother's maiden name to begin with. Or maybe it's the grandson-in-law doing it. And, he has no clue what his grandmother's mother's maiden name was. And if you're lucky, he says unknown instead of putting something wrong in the slot. You'll get nicknames. You will get, Meg and Daisy for Margaret, Molly and Polly for Mary. In Scotland, Janet, Jessie, and Jenny were often semi-interchangeable. You'll get cases where somebody had a name that when they were born that was not written in English. It was written in Cyrillic or Greek or Hebrew or Chinese or Korean. And so you get different ways, like for Korean, the surnames that we see as Lee and Ri, one with an R, one with an L, in Korean are actually start with a letter that's sort of halfway in between, and different families have anglicized it different ways. So sometimes you will get people who just translate a name. So for example, if you have French Canadian ancestors, you may have people who, just translated their name. Marie becomes Mary. And so on. Sometimes you'll get completely different names. I know this happened frequently with people who were Eastern European Jewish. I've seen it from people who were Italian. French Canadians were less likely to do it. They're more likely to just do a translation. And I think some of that is that English and French were close enough that you have more names that are the same. But you will sometimes see someone who had a French name that's not easily translatable, who is just takes a different name that they like. I'm amazed how many women decided to become Rose or Rosa in the early 1900s when they came to this country. They left some long Polish or French or Russian first name and became Rose or Rosa. And just to show you this is a list of a bunch of, basically all of the first 40 or so presidents. And take a look at some of the ways some of these names are. We know him as Jimmy Carter, but he could well be in a record as James Carter. Below him, it's George Walker Bush. Most of us here may know that because of Walker Point, but enough of the time George W. is George Washington, especially in the 1900s or in the 1800s, in the 19th century. I have had one case, which is why I did this, where somebody was George William, but always signed his name as George W. and ends up in a couple records as George Washington last name, because the assumption made by the clerk was that George W. was going to be George Washington surname. Does that make sense to everybody? And you'll see some of these others where you have, Rutherford B. Hayes. If you find somebody in the record that otherwise fits, whose name is Ford Hayes, that could be him. Same thing with Franklin Pierce. Frank, short first name, Pierce spelled differently than he usually did. Quincy Adams spelled the way it sounds. So I did this up. It was kind of fun to do this and figure out all the different ways these could be mangled, but they're not necessarily misspelled in 19th century terms. Everyone get that, what I'm trying to say? Okay. So let's talk about search strategies. You do want to keep track of siblings. And there are a couple reasons for that. As I said earlier, one of them is that if you have family here in Maine in the 19th century, if you have a sibling who goes off to Massachusetts, Maine did not start requiring birth, marriage, and death records until 1892. Massachusetts started requiring them in 1841. That's 51 years difference. I think that's 50. I went to library school because they told me there'd be no math. So I think, you know, it's a lot of time. It's 2 generations essentially, which means that if you know Tom and Bill are brothers and Tom goes off to Boston and you can find Tom's death record in 1887 with his parents' names, then you have a pretty good shot at those being Bill's parents' names as well, even if he died in 1883 and there's no death record in Maine for him. If you're looking on a census, the younger somebody is, the closer their ages usually are. Think about it this way. The difference between a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old is pretty big, but the difference between a 44-year-old and a 46-year-old isn't that big. So you'll want to look for children in the family. And then these next 2 sound contradictory. On one hand, you want to look for the unusual names. On the other hand, you want to look for the common and less easily misspelled names. In other words, if you've got someone in your family named Hezekiah, you know, good biblical name, but it's still likely to be misspelled more than John or Thomas or Robert, but there won't be as many Hezekiahs. And so you want to balance looking for the unusual name to narrow it down so that, you know, you're going to find a lot fewer Hezekiah Browns than Robert Browns in New England. So you'll want to balance looking for both of them. In a lot of cases, you will be able to put in keywords for occupations and things like that. You'll want to look and see what's in that database. And this is one of the reasons it's helpful to drill down and look at a specific database, because it will vary the details of what you can put in by what information is in that database. So for example, if you have a list of church members for somewhere, they may not have asked occupation, whereas they may have asked when the same man went and enlisted in the army. So the one database won't ask you for the occupation, but the other will have it as a possibility. Most of these websites allow wildcards and searching phonetically. I don't tend to recommend that much these days. They've gotten good enough with the variations that it's a last chance tactic at these days. And then the other thing is, and I'm going to show you an example with this shortly, you do not need to put a last name in the last name field at Ancestry. You can search with a first name and then a first name of somebody else in the household, for example, for census records. So let's get to looking at some examples. So here's one of my interesting ones. So in this case, we're looking for someone named Lockwood living in Saline County, Kansas, who was a carpenter. We've gotten this information, say, from a county history, and we're looking for it. Well, Kansas, in addition to the regular federal censuses in the years ending in 0, did a state census in 1875, which is great, except this census taker, Frank Wilkeson, had a bit of a sense of humor. And so in among the farmers and carpenters, we have Job Law, loafer, James Coleman, blowhard, and J.H. Lockwood, Bible banger. So if we're looking for a Lockwood who's a carpenter, this is a problem. Understand why? Because it may or may not, depending on how the database is set up, it may not bring this up because that's reading that as a legitimate occupation. I try to find things that are funny so that you'll remember them. I don't always succeed, but I try. So here's another one. This is a former coworker of mine. Her grandmother was named Arlene Joof. She was born in 1934 in New York City, and my coworker knew that Arlene's father's name was Kenneth. So I put all of this information in, and we have Caroline and Ronald Jr. and Leah and Marilyn and Stuart and Colleen, but no Arlene. So I took the Joof out because I said to myself, that's a name that could be misspelled or misheard or miscopied pretty easily, right? And look at this. Second answer is Arlene Joof, born in the right year, in the right place. And if we look at this, so I went just down to the 1940. And again, there we have her. Father's name is Kenneth because I've got that here. And you see how it filtered the two with Kenneth as the father's name to the first two results. This is why it's nice to go down further, because you'll notice here, it was hard, you don't get the father's name, and you also have all of this other stuff with the names. Whereas when I went down and actually looked in just the census, the names are here without other stuff around them. So if you're trying to look through a lot of them and skim, this is a lot easier to skim than this is, which is one reason I encourage you to go down to just the database you're interested in. So let's look at the original on this. And there's the family. And I can see why that was interpreted as a J, can't you? Let's look at this one. So that makes sense as a J, except if you look down the page a bit further, here's the J. It's very different. And I know when I was in school, we were taught to make our capital Fs like this with the cross, and the T was the same thing. And so, this is pretty, looking at this, it's pretty clearly Joof to me, but I can also see why the person just transcribing line by line and not looking at the whole page picked this up as Joof. Does that make sense to everybody? How this transcription error happened? And then one of the things, if you can't find somebody at one site, try the others, because look at this. The MyHeritage got this one right. So as I said, the global versus category search is really helpful. You can drill, and I'll talk about this more in a bit, but you can drill down to just the 1940 census or just the 1880 census or just marriage records for Massachusetts. And you do get that easier to read column. So one thing to think about is, are you collecting data? Are you searching, or are you researching? Collecting is just what it sounds like. You grab up everything that's possibly related and you drown in data. Trust me, been there, done that. Searching is more where you have some targeted searches, but you're not necessarily working through what's going to be your best strategy. Researching, if you think about it, is having a question saying, I want to know X. Who were William Patterson's parents? When and where did William Patterson marry Isabella Ralston? And where you focus on a question and finding the answer to the question. So I'm going to do this next example, and we'll see how we're doing on time at that point. But this is an interesting one. I sometimes hang out at the genealogy subreddit at Reddit. And this turned out to be a perfect example of some of what I was talking about earlier about don't assume it's a misspelling, don't assume they changed their name. So this person requested, said, I can't find this family, Antonio Frisoli, and his wife's name was Angelina Casoria. Turns out they settled in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He'd been, as he said, he'd been looking for months with finding nothing. So the first thing I did was I looked for somebody living in I went to the 1940 census, because when you're doing something like this, you may well end up with so many answers that, pieces of data, it's too much. So I went to the 1940 census and I limited it to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I looked for one of the daughters, actually, because he had given the names of the siblings when people asked. And so I went with Beatrice, because it was the name that was going to be reasonably not misspelled, but at the same time, it wasn't Mary or Anthony. And I came up with this, and we have Frisoli Anthony and his kids. So, okay, found one of them. Then, having figured some of this out, I went to 1930 and I put Beatrice in with no last name. And I know from here she's got a brother, Michael. And that, Beatrice is 22 in 1940. So we're looking at 12 and 17 in 1930 for these two kids. And I take a look at this and look at how that name is spelled. But the kids are in exactly the right order, the right ages. And can you see how Frisoli and Vassallo, if somebody is rushing to get stuff done, if Angelina's trying to get supper ready and she's just got half her mind on the census enumerator, because this is when they were still sending somebody around. You didn't get a thing in the mail to start with. It was all done by people going around. So then this is this person's response. There's no family history of anyone changing from Frisoli to Vassallo to Frisoli. So that's why I'm thinking it's someone else. This is not a name change. This is somebody misheard it, somebody miscopied it. It's basically just, there are good linguistics reasons for this. And if you're not a language geek, you can just trust me on that. But, he's still confused. Why would they change their last name like that? Well, I'm pretty sure it's them. Everything else fit. Then when I went back to 1920, there were these two families, and I don't remember which. I looked at the first one, and you can see the kids are wrong here. Beatrice is the wrong age. There's a whole bunch of kids that weren't there. Whereas if we look at this one, oh no, sorry. I think we decided that this was the right one because the names were off, but everything else was right. But I wasn't going to be quite as dogmatic there. So one more example. I'm looking for this Callahan family. It's Thomas Callahan, born about 1850 in Ireland. His wife, Mary McGee, born a couple years later. What I knew trying to look for them was that they were married. They were living in Edinburgh in 1855 when they registered a child's birth. And it gives their marriage date is 1846 or so in Dundee. And it had said they'd had a couple children born, but none were living when they registered this child in 1855. So I didn't know what children were around when the Scottish census was taken in 1851. And this is very definitely a case. I'd look, you don't want to know how many different ways I tried to spell Callahan. Because at Scotland's People, where the Scottish census is, you do have to put in at least part of a last name. So Ancestry does not have the originals of the Scottish census, but they have extracted records. So I went to Ancestry and put in, oh, come on, Thomas and Mary for Dundee, and found a Thomas Callahan, which is not a spelling I had come up with. And I went and looked, and this is at Scotland's People, and there they are. And that is indeed what it says there. But again, this is at a time and place where there weren't many people who were Irish on this side of Scotland. If it had been in Glasgow on the other side of Scotland, or in Liverpool or Manchester, there were a lot of Irish by this point, but there weren't that many in Dundee. So you had a census taker who wasn't familiar with Irish last names. And this is what you get. So I have talked for 57 minutes at this point. And so I'm going to stop so that we have something to talk about next week. But I definitely have time for questions if any of you have questions.
Thank you, BJ. I don't see any in the chat room yet, but let's just open up the floor for a few minutes. As you said, we have about 5 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you. Anybody can unmute, feel free to ask away.
I will. BJ, what got you started in your work with Ancestry? What sparked your interest?
I'd done stuff casually for a while. And in the late 90s, I had heard family stories. And when I married my now ex-husband, he was a historian from down south, so he'd never been to Boston. And we were living in Ohio, got married in Ohio. We're coming to Maine for our honeymoon and spending a couple of days in Boston en route. And so I decided, well, a couple of these stories I want to confirm. And so I started looking, and then slowly, or not so slowly, got sucked in. Because, basically on everything with genealogy, if you solve one puzzle, you have 3 more. And, it was at the beginning of the online era. The first few years I was doing this, email lists were the big thing. They were just starting out. And, the idea that I could post to an email list, and somebody who, I was living in Ohio, and somebody who was living in Edinburgh would look something up for me. And then I would look something up in Ohio for someone who was living in Arizona, was just amazing. This is like 1997, 98, 99. And, I just, you get pulled in. And then I took a couple trips to Scotland, which really pulled me in. And, it's one of those quirks. I enjoy it. I'm good at it. And I've always been that sort of inquisitive. You've never learned everything. If I had to trace that Frisoli family back to Italy, I know technique, but to know the records that are available for Italy, I have no clue. I don't want to say I have no clue, but I have very little clue. I would have to start almost from the beginning to trace in Italy, because I don't have family there. Working here in Maine, I don't run into many people. I spent almost 20 years of my adult life in Philadelphia. If I were doing this job in Philadelphia, I'd be learning Italian because every third person would have Italian family. Whereas here I've had to brush up on my French, which I don't speak at all, but I can read fairly well now, even early 19th century French, because that's what patrons come in with. It's easily 40% old New England Yankee families going back to Massachusetts and Connecticut, 40% French Canadian, and then 20% everything else. And so, my skills for colonial Massachusetts and colonial Quebec have been greatly refined in the last 5 years as I've been a genealogy librarian in Maine.
Thank you, BJ. Go right ahead. I know it says Judith Jones, but you need to unmute and ask your question, or I can try to unmute you if you need help. We probably only have time for this one last question. Do you want me to try to unmute you? Let's see if I can do that.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect, you got it.
Okay, since the solution to every problem causes three to arise, can you give us some clues as to how to keep this obsession within limits?
I'm not a good person to ask. I have all of my stuff here, and then I also have, it's taking over my office at the library. But the big thing is to come up with a system and stick to it. Whether you use a computer database, a notebook, index cards, but you want to write everything down. Because if you think you'll remember it, trust me, you won't. When you Xerox a copy of a page at a library or print it out at home on your computer, before you do anything else with it, write what it came from.
Yes, I can confirm that.
Because I can tell you, I have if every month or two, somebody comes into the library with a piece of paper and says to me, "What was this from?"
Hey, Chihuahua. Yeah.
And I actually have about a 75 or 80% success rate at identifying those. But that also means I have up to a 25% failure rate. And so write it down. Some people do everything digitally. They scan everything and do nice file names and have a database. I use a database. I will tell you, do not have an online database as your primary database. There are programs on your computer that don't take too much to learn. And you can sync them with Ancestry or whatever, but keep your data on your computer if you're going to do it computerized. But there are people who still do it on paper, and that's fine if that's what works for you.
No. Thank you.
But yeah, write it down and figure out how you're going to file stuff, whether it's photographs on your computer or hard copy. Just come up with a system and stick with it.
Thank you for asking that. Thank you for that, BJ. And can you, BJ, just describe to us how next week's presentation will differ from this week's, just to begin to close up tonight?
Yeah, what I'll encourage you to do is go and play around with Ancestry. Go into the library, or if you have it at home. I will have stuff ready if none of you come with questions to keep going the way I have tonight, but I'd rather work with you guys as you've started to play around with what I've talked about. Thinking about, does this database cover what I need? Or are the dates off? There is a card catalog at Ancestry as there is at Family Search. The one at Family Search is much better and much more critical because they're volunteer run. So they have a whole lot that's not been indexed. If you go to YouTube, and just a little promo here, and search for genealogy at the Maine State Library, you'll see a little picture of my great-grandmother as the icon. And if you go there, one of my programs that I did for this State Library Genealogy Club is called something like Hidden Resources at Family Search. And that's a good way to sort of get the idea of how you use the card catalogs at these sites. But, do that where you drill down to just one census year and look and see what it says, or, marriages for a state where you had relatives like Illinois. You go in and find the Illinois marriages and see what it says below the magic boxes you entered data in about what it actually covers. And just play around and bring the things that you can't figure out, and we'll go through them.
That sounds great. Thank you. Yeah. So hopefully all of you will come back next week, and maybe you can spread the word about next week's session. Even if others didn't attend, it would be worth having others join us. So we're going to close up for tonight, and thank you, BJ, very much. This has been very informative. I think you've got some followers here who are going to try some things, and those spellings were very, very interesting to really see how that all plays out.
Yeah, the whole and one of the ones I didn't get to as a sample tonight, but it's true. It is really helpful. Doing the searching for somebody with just their first name, particularly with the censuses, their first name and another person in the household, if you know where they lived, can be really helpful. It saved me more times than I care to tell you, as a way of finding somebody. It's, if I had to say if I have to claim one trick as a genealogy librarian, why people come in and say, well, if you're just going to do a Google search, I could have done this at home, and I can't say to them, well, sorry, but my Google search is going to be better than your Google search. But if I could say the same thing about being a genealogy librarian, that trick of looking without a last name, and looking for, like the name of the sister Rose with the brother Hezekiah. So you've got the one that's not misspelled and easily known, and then the one that, so you're balancing that trick of looking without last names when I'm pretty sure of a geographic location. Obviously it doesn't work for finding a sister Maria with a brother Antonio in New York City in 1910. But, it works for a Beatrice with a Michael in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So that's the sort of thing that's the big takeaway you should get is that you need to be flexible. Names were flexible. It's not, even when people start to get that they're flexible, they still have this mental image of the name is misspelled, and you need to let go of that. I don't want to sound like woo-woo and new age, but you need to let go of that energy. You just need to assume the name's going to be mangled.
Will do. It's a fantastic tip. So we will all hopefully join you again next week. And
so see you next week.
Those of you who would like to do that, make sure you just email for the registration link for next week's presentation. And thank you, BJ. Good night, everybody. Be well and stay healthy. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.